Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we are starting our St. John Passion leg of the journey. I have already analyzed, it looks like 3 chorales from the St. John Passion, meaning that we have another 8 to look at. Very excited. I actually had the pleasure of seeing my local orchestra perform the St. John Passion 3 or 4 Christmases ago. It was an absolute delight. My ear training instructor is or my former ear training instructor, he is the director of my local symphony choir or chorus, so it was very exciting to see him and his colleagues perform. It was a marvelous performance. But that being said, we're going to hop right into this analysis of Herz, liebste Jesu, was hast du verbrochen, which translates to, O dearest Jesus, what law hast thou broken? This is a text that we should be pretty familiar with at this point, just because of the fact that we've seen it harmonized quite frequently in the St. Matthew Passion, so the fact that the St. John Passion follows it chronologically, I guess, or numerically, in the BWV numbers, perhaps Bach is going through a trend and we're seeing similar texts being used. But that being said, this is a fairly straightforward chorale. We do have some interesting chromaticism in this chorale, but nothing. It doesn't really hold a candle to yesterday's episode. If you want a really exciting analysis, check out yesterday's episode. It was a really fascinating chorale with a surprise ending. But with that being said, let's not tarry on too long. We'll just hop right into the analysis. So 2 flats in the key signature. We start on G minor, we end on G major. I reckon we are in the key of G minor. We then go to C, B flat, E flat, and G. That is C minor 7 in root position, so that is a 4-7 chord. We also have some passing tones going on here in the alto and the bass. Kind of have a 1-6-4 chord going on there, but I don't really think that's contributing too much to the progression. I'm going to omit it. We then have E flat, A, C, and G. That technically is a 2-4-3 chord, A minor 7 flat 5 over E flat, but sorry, goodness, I lost my breath there. I think this this A natural is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually sorry, that looks like 8-10-3. I don't know what I was trying to write there. 8-6-3. I think this is a C minor chord over E flat. This is a half cadence right here where we cadence on D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord. And if we know anything about 5 chords or half cadences, we know that there's a particular type of cadence called a Phrygian half cadence. And a Phrygian half cadence consists of the flat 6 going to the 5 in the bass. It's a particular type of half cadence. Don't really know why it's categorized as its own thing. Would have to look more into the history of the analysis and why its usage is any more interesting than other half cadences. I think actually in the context of the chorales, it's more interesting to see a cadence or a half cadence that has the 3rd of the chord in the melody rather than the 5th of the melody, as opposed to focusing on this E flat going to D here. But the textbook preaches about the Phrygian half cadence and how the flat 6 going to 5 in minor is a gesture that is deserving of individual attention. It deserves its own title. But if you know anything about half cadences, you know that 2-4-3 chords and 4-6 chords are often in close proximity to one another, and I feel like this A is functioning like A. A is functioning like A, go figure. This A is actually functioning more like A accented non-chord tone, because in Phrygian half cadences the 4-6 chord is always there, and sometimes we get the 2-4-3 chord in the mix, but it's always we always get a 4-6 chord somewhere in the texture. And if we could extrapolate the 4-6 chord from what's happening on the entirety of the beat, that is to suggest that we omit the A and take this G as our doubled chord tone here. I think that's more accurate analysis. It's more of a reflection of what happens in all half cadences, but 2-4-3 versus 4-6, they're basically the same chord, so I think either analysis is correct. It's more important that you know that they, I guess the individual context and sort of how they operate and pop up in the chorales. Looking ahead, we do have another half cadence though in G minor, so no modulation yet. We move immediately to C, F sharp, A, and D, which is D7 over C, so the D doesn't change, but the figure bass changes to reflect third inversion 7 chord. And then we go to B minor, sorry, B minor. That would be very interesting. Now we go to G minor over B flat, G, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. We also have some melodic minor going on, D, E natural, F sharp. This E natural is a passing tone. And then we get A, C, F sharp, and A, which is F sharp diminished over A. That is our 7-6 chord. And then we go to our tonic triad, G, D, G, and B flat. This is a very pure occurrence of a very common progression that we get in Bach's chorales 1-6-7-6-1, or the inverse 1-7-6-1-6. It's this idea that we have two chords that have similar chord tones, right? Or identical chord tones, just respelled. One is in root position, one is in first inversion, or they're just one inversion apart. I've seen 1-6 go to 1-6-4, but the chord in the middle is a chord that is one diatonic step below, so in this case that would be 7 in comparison to 1, and in first inversion. We're going to see another example of this not using tonic triads later to sort of verify this theory as this progression being one that's codified, as if it needs to be codified anymore. This progression's been used probably close to 100 times in Bach, at least what I've analyzed so far. But yes, 1-6-7-6-1. Typically we see the 7-6 chord occur at the same time as a 2 chord, and this F sharp is also part of a passing figure with E. But I feel like it's less, maybe it's less common in minor keys and more common in major keys because of the augmented second that would create. But regardless, here we see the progression very plainly written. I think further strengthening my analysis that I've done in previous videos, dozens and dozens and dozens of previous videos. Afterwards, we get another tonic triad, G, D, G, and B flat, so we don't need to analyze again. And then we get F sharp, E flat, A, and C. This is F sharp fully diminished 7th in root position, that's our 7 chord. And then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, another tonic triad. Lots of 7s and lots of 1s so far, in this phrase at least. And then we cadence on D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, that's our 5 chord. Notice how this half cadence is a little bit more normal for Bach. We have a 5th of the chord in the melody. This is true for almost all half cadences. That's what I think makes this half cadence particularly interesting, not the Phrygian nature of it, but you know, maybe it is interesting. Maybe I've been conditioned by the textbook, I don't know, but point both of them out for those of you who are interested. Try and be as thorough as possible because I'm focusing only on really one aspect of the chorale, or two I guess. I do focus a little bit on the form with the cadences, but try and be as thorough as possible with the chords and talk about varying perspectives and how one's analysis could read. But afterwards we get another D major chord. This is the second time we've had a phrase end with a dominant and follow with another dominant, so it's interesting. Typically, I don't want to say typically, that's kind of a strong phrasing, but sometimes we see a figure in Bach where we'll get two redundant chords, and the second of the chord of the redundant chords will be the one that gets the fermata. But here we have the first one getting the fermata, and then we get a repeat of the chord in the next phrase. I think that's particularly interesting. But we get another D major chord here, no inversion or anything, we keep the same bass, so no need to reanalyze, and then we go to G minor. But before we analyze any further, we should look ahead and see that we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat, so we're looking for a point in which we modulate, and I'm convinced that we modulate over this G minor chord. This is a relatively common chord modulation between the tonic of a minor key turning into the submediant in the relative major. After all, the keys are very closely related due to the fact that they share a pitch collection, and this typically turns into some type of predominant chord, like in this case where we have C, E flat, A, and C, which is A diminished. It's no longer 2. It is now our leading tone chord in the key of B flat, A diminished over C. And then we get B flat major, B flat, F, B flat, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. We also have a couple of passing tones in the tenor and the melody. before we get A flat, D, F, and B flat. This A flat in the bass, similar to what's happening here with this D7 chord. This is another dominant 7 chord in third inversion. This is 5-4-2, but because B flat is the root of this chord, we know it is a secondary dominant, so this would be 5-4-2 of 4. B flat also happens to be the dominant of E flat. We also have a passing tone in the tenor, and sure enough we get E flat major afterwards. E flat, B flat, G, and E flat, 4-6. And here is where the progression gets interesting. We also have a passing leading tone here. Typically in 4-6 chords, we usually, 4-6 chords, I usually talk about how there's always a leading tone connecting the 6th of the scale and the root of the scale in the bass. It's never just a third leap between the 4-6 chord and the tonic triad, but we're not going from 4-6 to our tonic here, but we still see the connection of the 6th of the scale to the root of the scale here, or the tonic of the scale. It just so happens to be in the alto. So I think that that's kind of interesting. But we go immediately from E flat major to E flat minor, G flat, B flat, B flat, and E flat, which is now our 4-6. And there probably is a figured bass for this, but I'm just going to change the Roman numeral just because of the fact that I feel like the visual distinction between the uppercase and the lowercase makes the kind of matches the statement that having the cross relations, where the quality of the triad is being changed in such close proximity to one another, is it's matching that same energy, uppercase to lowercase, just as a visual analog for what's going on in the score. Okay, so after our E flat minor chord, we're getting a little mode mixture here where we are borrowing from the parallel minor. We go to the relative major, then we borrow from the parallel minor. I think that's pretty cool because in yesterday's chorale, and this is probably coincidental, we also had mode mixture in a much more heavy-handed fashion, but still mode mixture and relatively closely related chorales. Perhaps it's more than a coincidence. I don't know. We can't ask Bach, unfortunately. Maybe we'll have the technology at some point, but no, probably not. We have some passing tone, or we have a passing tone going on in the tenor as well, before we get F, D, B flat, and D. It's always fascinating to see passing 1-6-4 chords in the middle of the phrase. They do pop up from time to time. They're not the most common chord, but this is by no means unprecedented. We do see them with some frequency, and it's a passing chord, and we do have to take progressions that are chromatically that have a chromatic baseline, because of the fact that in a lot of these cases Bach is limited in terms of the chords that can be used, and different chord progressions emerge. I would argue that the most fascinating chord progressions in the chorales emerge when there is chromaticism in the baseline, or more specifically chromatic passing tones and long strings in the baseline, because we have a long string here from A flat to E natural, outlining a diminished fourth. That's pretty cool too. Okay, yeah, passing 1-6-4 chord. This B flat's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get E natural, G, B flat, and D flat. This is E natural diminished 7th, which would be a secondary dominant, or a secondary leading tone chord of 5, because E is the leading tone to F, and F is our 5 chord. So we would expect a 5 chord on the other side. This C is also it's also an anticipation. This C is not a passing tone, it's an anticipation. It's hard to check non-chord tones and what exactly they are when you're going from system to system. But yeah, this C is repeated here in the melody. But this 5 chord, F, F, B flat, and C, this B flat is a 4-3 suspension that resolves on the next beat. We also get a passing, or I guess a delayed passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on B flat, which is our tonic triad. Okay, looking ahead, we have a longer phrase. I guess it kind of matches the previous phrase in length for the most part. Maybe it's a little bit longer. I'm having a hard time comparing them just on the fly. But we have another authentic cadence in the key of B flat major. This time, however, we are in we're ending on an imperfect authentic cadence. So starting things off, there might be a slight argument to be made here that we do move briefly to the key of D minor, but I don't think that's super likely the more that I'm looking at it. There is some secondary chromaticism here, but again, when you see ascending, or descending for that matter too, when you see what's a good way to say that, stepwise chromatic motion in the bass, we typically see really interesting chord progressions, and that rings true for this 3-chord phrase fragment here. We go from B flat major to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 6th chord. Had to listen to this phrase a couple of times. I said, do we go to G minor at the beginning of it? I don't think so, because we end this, I guess, little sub-phrase here of these 4 notes. This does sound like an idea here that then continues into the rest of the phrase, but ending in G minor on a minor 5 chord, which is what this D minor chord would be, it'd be relatively unprecedented, and at the end of the day, it really does feel like D minor is the object here, which could suggest that this G minor chord is the 4 chord of this D minor little sub-phrase here. But at the end of the day, I do think we still stay in the key of B flat major. This is just secondary chromaticism. So we then have C, C, E flat, and A, which is A diminished in first inversion, so that would be 7, 6 in the key of B flat. So we're just seeing a adjacent harmony here, 6 going to 7. That's a relatively common progression, probably like a high mid-tier progression that we see in terms of frequency. And this D is a passing tone as well. And then we get our ascending chromaticism, C sharp, B flat, E, and G, which is C sharp fully diminished over, it's actually in root position. It's a fully diminished 7th, similar to the 7 chord that we had here. But in this case, we are tonicizing 3, not 5. And that's what we get on the other side of it. We get D, A, D, and F, which is our 3 chord. And I don't know why I didn't see this earlier. 7 going to 3 is a totally normative progression. It is the place that 7 wants to go the most via the cycle of falling fifths. So 7 going to 3, even though we see 7 probably go to 1 the most, because it is, at the end of the day, a dominant chord. If you choose to, I guess, traverse a diatonic scale by fifths, 7 goes to 3. And that is a very popular way that composers derived chord progressions back then. Maybe even nowadays too. But that being said, yeah, this is just an intermediary chord between 7 and 3. Pretty cool stuff. To kind of parallel diminished chords, even though they have pretty much contrary motion in every way. We have it going here versus going to up versus down and then up. It's pretty cool. Okay, after our 3 chord, we have what I'm calling another 3 chord, D, F, A, and D, but we do have some interesting passing tones here. We have C, F, A, and E flat, which, if you look at the chord that we have on the downbeat of the next measure, we have B flat, D, D, and F, which is our tonic triad. And 3 going to 1, it's not really a progression. Yes, it's 1 chord going to the next, therefore it is a progression, but I feel like chords that are a third apart, objectively they're the weakest progression, and that's not because I don't like the way they sound. That's not me trying to make a comment on, trying to limit people from writing the way that they want to write, or critiquing a particular composer. If you look at, triadic chord progressions or tertian chord progressions, and you take a 3 chord and a 1 chord, for example, or any 2 chords that are a third apart, they share more notes in common than they don't. So when you go from 1 chord to another chord that is a third away, it almost sounds like you're going to the same chord. I mean, the difference between D minor and B flat major is A versus B flat. It's a half step. It's not a tremendous difference, so it feels less like a progression and more like a prolongation. That's just my relationship with the harmony. I think there is validity to suggesting that, 3 going to 1 is a totally valid progression. I am of that school of thought. I think it's a very valid progression. But I think in very few cases are you going to find 3 going to 1 in the same way that you're going to see 7 going to 1, or 5 going to 1, or 5 going to 4. More common chord progressions that are going to be chords that are adjacent to one another, or chords that are a fourth away from one another. But in this case, we actually don't even have 3 going to 1. With these passing tones, we have C, F, A, and E flat, which is kind of like a passing 5-4-3 chord, F7 over C, and I feel like this is a pretty cool, or maybe it is cool, but I guess to be a little bit more articulate about it, Bach is sort of maybe he's aware of the fact that 3 going to 1 is like not the most flavorful progression. I don't know even if there's vocabulary that just describes the quality of the progression. Ironically, 3 going to 5, or maybe ironically is a little strongly worded, coincidentally, 3 going to 5 is another third progression away. I feel like it kind of gets a pass, though. I know here I am sort of putting my foot in my mouth saying that chords that are a third away from one another don't really create a progression. But 3 going to 5, I feel like as far as thirds-based progressions are concerned, kind of get a pass, because 5 is a dominant chord, and a chord that precedes 5 tends to take on that predominant function. So I feel like as far as thirds-based progressions are concerned, 3 going to 5 might be the most progression-like out of all of them, but it still embodies the same principle that all chord progressions that are a third apart have, which is the chords aren't all that far away from one another. I mean, D minor going to B flat is the difference between A and B flat. D minor versus F major is a difference between D and C. So it's just a whole step versus a half step. The chords are mostly in common, but when you change the structure of a 3 chord to a 5 chord, the role of the 5 chord quickly assumes its position, it is strong, and then it sort of demands another stable chord on the other side of it. There aren't other progressions that have that same heft, where both the leading tone and the fifth of the scale are present, where there's that, I guess, kind of sense of urgency to resolve. Pretty cool stuff. Maybe I'm just crazy, I don't know. I think that it's a relatively fair take, but 3 going to 1 would have been fine too. It would have been interesting in its own ways. We have some passing tones in the bass and the alto here before we get D, B flat, F, and F, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Sometimes we get a 7 chord here, and we have the E flat, the F, and the C, or a passing 5 chord would achieve the same thing that a 7 chord would do. But we have a B flat here, it would be like a sus chord, like an F sus 7. But that is just in theory here. We can't really analyze the chord. We can talk about it, but it's not going to make its way onto the page, unfortunately. Also, this B flat's a chord tone, so I'm not going to mark it. We then get E flat, B flat, F, and G. Talk about another sus chord. This is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but this is an E flat major chord. E flat major in root position, which is our 4 chord. And then we have F, A, E flat, and F. Now here's the other instance of this pattern that Bach tends to use, and this is probably the second most common iteration or a configuration of this pattern, being completely dwarfed by the number of occurrences that we see tonics and 7 chords being used. But I'd say this is the most likely next candidate. So this could be analyzed as a 5/7 chord that's incomplete, sure, but I feel like this E flat is an accented non-chord tone in the same way that this F is an accented non-chord tone. So I feel like this is a figure where Bach is leaning into the chord on the offbeat, or sorry, not the chord on the offbeat. I guess the chord is assembling on the offbeat, but he's leaning into the chord tone that actually occurs on the and of the beat. We have D, F, and A here, another 3 chord. And it happens to be in first inversion, 3/6. And if we look on the next beat, we have G, B flat, D, and E flat, which is another E flat major chord as its foundation, but it happens to be a 7th chord as well. And I mean, I guess you could even make the argument that the 7th is very short. It's the longest of the note values that occur on this beat, but still we have 4 going to some type of 4/6 chord bridged by a chord that is a diatonic step below it. Also happens to be a half step below it, like 1 and 7. Maybe that's why it's the most common. But 4, 3, 6, 4, 6. And I think that same pattern sort of rings true for all sorts of different chords that are a diatonic step away from a first inversion counterpart. Okay, we're getting close to our cadence now. I've had a lot to say about this chorale. I don't know why I'm so chatty today, but I feel like there are just like some fundamental aspects about this particular chorale that lended themselves well for like an educational or like a teaching moment. But after our 4/6/5 chord, we have A, F, C, and E flat. we know that an imperfect authentic cadence is the same rules really don't apply for perfect authentic cadences. We tend to see all sorts of inverted chords and interesting predominance in imperfect authentic cadences, as well as the whole host of regular authentic cadence progressions like 2-5-1, 4-5-1, just 1-5-1, you name it, the things that you'd see more commonly in a perfect authentic cadence. But afterwards, after our 5-6-5 chord, F7 over A, this is B flat, F, B flat, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. We are now looking for a point in which we modulate back to the key of G minor in anticipation for our last cadence. It is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor, and we have an interesting situation here. Now, the way that I hear it, I hear this B flat major chord still in the key of B flat. The way that I hear this is I hear that we are still in the key of B flat major until we get to the G minor here. We have D, C, B flat. That sounds like mi, re, do, 3, 2, 1 in the key of B flat to me. So I feel like this is one of the cases where the modulation happens after the secondary dominant. But I think that this presents another modulation zone, right? Depending on how you hear it, depending on where you feel like it's most appropriate, you could say that the analysis or the modulation starts as early as the downbeat of, or the pickup to the phrase. In this case, I'm going to analyze it over this chord and stay in the key of B flat up until that point, but just know that you could analyze it at any which one of these, or I guess at this point or this point. I don't think it's happening on the secondary dominant or on this dominant functioning chord, depending on how you look at it. But this B flat major chord here, B flat, F, D, or sorry, B flat, F, B flat, and D, those are all chord tones for a tonic triad, so we don't need to reiterate the analysis. Then we have F sharp, E flat, A, and C. That's another 7-7 chord, this time of 6. Interesting how we've seen 7-7 of 5, 7-7 of 3, and this one's up for debate because we could very well be in the key of G minor at this point, but because I'm analyzing it in B flat, 7-7 of 6. So it's interesting that we've seen that chord in multiple contexts, where we've seen that as the secondary dominant of choice just by majority choice. We've also seen 5, but most of the time it's 7. That's pretty interesting. And then we get our 6th chord, G, D, G, and B flat. And this is where I think we go to G minor. It's where we exited G minor, and it is where we're going back into G minor. Perhaps that's why I hear it that way. I don't know if I feel like with this much content in between the two keys, and notice how we've only been in G minor versus B flat, unless you hear this as a little bit of a D minor escapade here, but we've only really seen B flat and G minor, which is atypical for a chorale. We usually see at least one more key be visited. At least that's what my intuition tells me. I don't have that down on paper yet. I have to crunch those numbers once I have all of my ducks in a row, all of my data assembled for research once I finish this journey. But who knows? I feel like maybe this is sort of like a cyclical sort of full circle of a modulatory scheme in this particular chorale. We enter through the same point, we exit through the same point. We also have what is it called? An anticipation in the melody again before we get C sharp, E, G, and A. That's A7 over C sharp, which is another 5-6-5 chord. We've seen a couple of these before. One is a dominant chord here, and I feel like we've seen one more. No, we saw a 7-4-2 chord earlier. Oh no, a 5-4-2 chord. That's what we saw earlier. Here we're saying 5-6-5 of 5 because A is the dominant of D, and D is our 5 chord, or our dominant in the key of G minor. And that goes where we would expect it to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, with a passing 7th in the tenor. Bach loves his passing 7ths, and I feel like the most of the time they wind up in the tenor. And then we cadence not on G minor, but G major. We know that Bach, for the most part, ends his minor chorales with a major chord. And if you listen to if you've listened to any of my older videos, you'll know that I think that it has to do with ending the chorale on a more uplifting note. That might be true for the cantatas, where the chorale is often the last movement. Not always, but virtually always. A cantata or a chorale is the last movement. But in this case, we have several movements afterwards, so I feel like it's more just a convention of chorale writing for Bach, more so than anything else, and that's all that it needs to be. But I have really talked at length about this chorale. Really, as far as chorales are concerned, this is relatively plain. We do have an interesting little, I guess we have two instances of chromaticism, ascending and descending here, stepwise motion, which is always interesting to analyze those chord progressions. But other than that, fairly straightforward chorale. I think honestly it's equally as interesting to see that we've only seen the key of B flat and G minor in a chorale setting. We typically visit at least one other key, maybe the key of the subdominant, maybe the key of the dominant. I don't know, but this is a relatively plain setting as far as key exploration is concerned. So I'd say those are the two biggest takeaways, and I'm going to cap the video off on that thought. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon. You could also like the video if you liked the video. There are lots of videos in the content pipeline. I have almost 200 more videos scheduled for the future. Very, very excited for those to release. I'm excited for tomorrow's analysis always, if you've listened to the last to the outro video of my videos in the past. But that being said, yes, thank you so much for supporting the channel by watching this video. I of course look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.